Alright, so today we're going to start a little series on Saturn and the Sade Sati. I've done some other videos on this, specifically to the Sade Sati in different houses, but I want to take this in a little bit different direction. I want to talk about, number one, how much emphasis we need to put on the Sade Sati, and number two, I want to talk about how you can make your Sade Sati worse and how you can make your Sade Sati better. Because these are two things that we need to know as we go through these particular transits and these particular dashas related to the Sade Sati. Now, there are a few tools that you can start to utilize right away. One of them is a free course on the Asheville Vedic Astrology.com site. It's a free downloadable course on the Sade Sati, so you can find that under the downloadable courses tab. And this is a section from the much longer course, The Myth and Magic of Vedic Astrology, where we look at the planets, we understand how to work with the planets and their general energies through the myth, and also remedies such as mantra and various activities. But anyway, this is a free section of that course that you can download and listen to get some sense of how to begin working with your Sade Sati period. But before we get into that, one of the reasons I'm doing this video is because, as many of you know, I have Saturn fairly prominent in my chart. So far in my life, I've gone through two Sade Sati periods, one when I was very young and one very recently. And so these kinds of things are fresh on my mind, and I know how difficult these things can be for an individual. When I went through my Sade Sati the first time, it was a very difficult time period for my family. Someone very close to me passed on during that time, which was also very hard to deal with as a child. During my second Sade Sati, all kinds of interesting things happened. One of my mentors, who I was very close to, passed on. He was elderly, but still, that doesn't make it any less difficult. Two of my best friends passed on during this time. That was also extremely hard to deal with. But that's not to say good things didn't happen. All kinds of good things did occur during this time period due to working with Saturn in a very hard way. And the interesting thing about all of this was that the difficulties, as Saturn creates them, were just life happening. Oftentimes when we think about our Sade Sati period, we think about it as though that this is a time period of extreme punishment, when it's not, and that's not necessarily how Saturn functions. We can think that that is the case, particularly if we're not willing to listen to what Saturn has to share with us. But that's just the same as when you're dealing with an authoritative parent who really has your best interest in heart, but as a spoiled little brat child, you can't see that, and so it seems like the parent is being very punitive. But Saturn is, in a sense, bringing to our awareness how to be in reality, how to deal with the things of life. For example, I'm not a Buddhist, but I have read some of Buddhist texts, and I am interested in the philosophy because it did contribute to one of my favorite books called Vasista's Yoga. But we know that life is considered to be suffering. And as soon as we can make peace with that, live with that knowledge, well, then we can also enjoy the good things in life. And when someone goes through a Sade Sati period, or a Saturn return, or a Saturn dasha, what we'll find is that they're often confronted with difficulties in their life that are, in a sense, calling one to grow up, calling one to realize that, hey, not everything's going to work out so easy for you, and you have to learn to understand and deal with that hardship. I was recently having a discussion with my brother-in-law. We were talking about, family, and one of our relatives is kind of keeping some information from their little kid because they're afraid it would hurt them. And one of the things my brother-in-law said is, I've done some reading, and it seems that children who go through or are allowed to experience difficult things, where they're not pampered, where everything's not kept from them, where they're not coddled, tend to develop better character. And that's true. And one of the things that Saturn does is it does build your character. It builds your capacity for compassion, as we'll see as we get through this discussion and why that's the case. But the point that I'm trying to get at here is that whether you're going through a Saturn Dasha, a Sade Sati, whether you are going through a Saturn return, a lot of the difficulties that are going to be coming your way are simply things that are calling you, urging you to grow up, to realize that there are difficulties in this world that you have to deal with, and then you have to learn to deal with them with grace and with poise. And the better you can do that from the very beginning, oftentimes the better the Sade Sati will go. Doesn't always mean that every difficult thing stops, because again, just like in my case, where I had one of my mentors pass on because he was older. Well, that was going to happen anyway. We're all going to go through experiences like that. When I was a child, one of the people that I lost was also an older individual. But that was still not easy for a person. When I lost my friends, they were lost to an illness, a disease. And that's just part of life. That thing, those kinds of things occur in life, right? And we got to do our best to move through them with poise and with grace. And when we don't know what their paths are, right? We got to look at things beyond just this little finite world of what is important to me, because their paths, who knows what they're up to right now, right? As you move through life to life, to hold on to something, to hold on to another person's life just because it's going to inconvenience you emotionally to let them go. That's in a sense dishonoring the timeless connection that you might have with someone. So things like death, illness, poverty, obstacles, setbacks, delays, frustrations, these are all often related to the Sade Sati period. Now, before we get into how you can make your Sade Sati period better and how you can make your Sade Sati period worse, those will probably be two separate videos. I just want to take a moment to discuss, generally, we don't want to get too freaked out by Sade Sati. Now, astrologically, how do we determine if something's going to be problematic for you? Well, for example, my first Sade Sati that I went through, I was in a Saturn Dasha. Oh, I forgot, even during that time period, I had an extreme health issue, which actually left me somewhat handicapped. I lost my hearing during that time. I still don't have it. I've got half of it, but not all of it. So, if any of you ever meet me in a seminar or at a conference and you're talking to me and I don't seem to respond, well, that's why. So I forgot that also occurred during this time period. So a lot of things went on with my family, with my health, with a loved one in my life, and so on. And it was not a fun time period. But what made it particularly difficult was the dasha I was in. I happened to be in a Saturn dasha. And it's not just that the Saturn dasha itself is difficult, because Saturn may be in a good placement. But if you have other planets hitting that Saturn by aspect, planetary aspect, or in difficult positions from that Saturn in your birth chart, the subcycles are often what's going to make it worse. So if someone's in, say, a Sade Sati period, and they have a good dignity Jupiter, they've got a good dignity Saturn, and they're influencing each other, well, that can often make the Sade Sati period actually better. If you've got a really difficult Saturn, it's in bad dignity, maybe it's got difficult Lajatati Avashtas against it, and there's no help from its friends, or there's no aspect from Jupiter, you're going to tend to have a more difficult time period then. And the worst times will be when you're in a dasha, when, say, you're in Saturn Mars, or the big one with Sade Sati is Saturn Moon. If you're in a Saturn Moon period, then that amplifies the whole experience, because Sade Sati is all about when Saturn crosses over your moon by transit in the birth chart. So wherever your moon is in the birth chart, when Saturn crosses over that moon, that's going to be the most difficult time period. And because many astrologers want to make a lot of money selling you blue sapphires or other remedies, they make it a big deal that it's a 7.5 year period. Well, it could be that long, but generally the worst time periods are when Saturn is in the same sign as your moon. The transiting Saturn is going through the same sign as your moon. And it will be more difficult the closer Saturn gets to that moon. Especially if it happens to end up sharing the same Navamsha, it'll cause difficulties with your life purpose, your path. When it goes in the same Dasamsha, the Dasamsha is the D10. The Dasamsha is the chart for your activity in the world. Well, it can cause difficulties with your career, your status, your purpose. So seeing how that Saturn is transiting close to the moon and what Varga essentially it seems to be sharing, whether it's transiting the same sign that creates the Navamsha, wherever the moon Navamsha is in, or the Dasamsha, or the Chaturtamsha, whatever it might be. The Varga is very important in this regard. And those of you who want to learn more about the Vargas, do stay tuned, because I will be posting some videos which are excerpts from a Vargas course we did last year, which I'll also be editing and trying to make available to you. But that's how you're going to start to see when and how the Sade Sati period is going to hit you in a more difficult way. And then if you happen to be in a dasha of a planet hurting that Saturn, that's going to tend to make it worse. But if you happen to be in the dasha of a wonderful Jupiter or wonderful Venus, and they're not interacting with Saturn in a difficult way, that's when you get people who write to you and say, oh, I've been in this, Sade Sati period, but it's been fine. All these astrologers made all these difficult predictions and none of them came to pass. So this is why we have to be very cautious of all the mythology, folklore, really more so folklore, and hype around the Sade Sati period. It is a very important period because it's about your time to grow up emotionally, to mature. It's like putting you in the crucible. But you can be put in a crucible where you're getting your limbs cut open and salt poured into it, or you can be put in a crucible where you're just having to work really hard. You're not able to go home to your family. You're having to put your nose to the grindstone and improve yourself and these sorts of things. So how it all plays out is dependent on your chart in particular. So we have to keep that in mind. You want to make sure you do have an honest astrologer, someone who's not trying to sell you gemstones, not trying to sell you other things. You also want to make sure you don't have a fearful astrologer, because that can make it a lot worse. But it may be that Saturn is difficult in your chart, and the astrologer is just simply telling you this is going to be a rough period, so you got to start doing some inner work. Now, the main things I always recommend to people is get that free downloadable course I mentioned on Sade Sati and the Saturn return at this website or my website, AstrovedicAstrology.com. It's totally free. Just get it, listen to it. It'll give you a lot of good ideas. Number 2, a great thing to do would be to get the book The Greatness of Saturn, The Greatness of Saturn by Robert Svoboda. That book has helped me so much through my Saturn return, through my Sade Sati period. And I'm going to discuss how to work with the greatness of Saturn as a particular kind of remedy. I'll put a little link at the bottom of this video so that you can get to it. I might even write a little article on my webpage as a blog at AstrovedicAstrology.com on my experiences with the greatness of Saturn. I even treat that book as a holy object in and of itself. I use it to focus on for meditation and these sorts of things, because there's a lot of good information in that book. In fact, now that I think about it, maybe when I do the video on how to improve your Sade Sati, I'll just discuss the main points of that book. But anyway, The Greatness of Saturn by Robert Svoboda. Check the link out at the bottom of this video, or just Google it, but it's right there for you. So those are the 2 most important things that you can start doing now, whether you're in a Sade Sati period, whether you've got Saturn in a difficult state within your chart, whether you want to simply improve your relationship to Saturn. Whether you're in a Saturn return, whether you're in a Saturn dasha, whatever it might be, these things can be helpful. The other thing I often recommend to clients with a difficulty with Saturn, who needs to grow and improve their Saturn, I do this with the nodes too, is a book called The Presence Process by Michael Brown, which I'll also put in a link down at the bottom here. And that's not an easy process to go through. It does require a lot of personal work, but if you can engage in it and take it seriously, it can do a lot of good stuff for you psychologically and emotionally and help you grow through difficult periods related to Saturn, because this is all about you growing into an emotionally healthy individual. It's all about you learning to become strong, learning to do what you need to do, not because you want to, but because it's good for you. In a sense, learning to do your duty, learning to not complain so much. So these are things to consider so far about the Sade Sati period. The next video I will do will be on how to make your Sade Sati period worse. And you might find that you're actually doing these things, so you want to stop it. And then after that, part 3 will be how to improve your Sade Sati period beyond the specific things we just discussed.